It is before dawn. England, February 1944. The airfields of East Anglia are cold and dark. Frost pressed into the grass, mist curling low across the tarmac. But the ground crews are already moving, quietly, purposefully. Men in heavy jackets, dragging fuel lines, checking ammunition belts, wiping condensation from canopy glass with bare hands. In the briefing rooms, young men sit in wooden chairs staring at maps. Maps that show lines stretching east, deep into Germany, past the Rhine, past the industrial heartland, all the way to a city ringed in red. Berlin, the German capital, the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. For 2 years, American bombers had been bleeding over Europe, cut apart by Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs before they could even reach their targets. The Luftwaffe had ruled these skies with brutal efficiency. Entire formations wiped from the air. Entire crews gone before breakfast was cleared. But something had changed. Parked on the hard stands outside, sleek, silver, long-nosed, sat a machine that no German pilot had yet learned to fear enough. The P-51 Mustang. And today, it was going all the way. It is before dawn. England, February 1944. The airfields of East Anglia are cold and dark. Frost pressed into the grass, mist curling low across the tarmac. But the ground crews are already moving, quietly, purposefully. Men in heavy jackets, dragging fuel lines, checking ammunition belts, wiping condensation from canopy glass with bare hands. In the briefing rooms, young men sit in wooden chairs staring at maps. Maps that show lines stretching east, deep into Germany, past the Rhine, past the industrial heartland, all the way to a city ringed in red. Berlin, the German capital, the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. For 2 years, American bombers had been bleeding over Europe, cut apart by Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs before they could even reach their targets. The Luftwaffe had ruled these skies with brutal efficiency. Entire formations wiped from the air. Entire crews gone before breakfast was cleared. But something had changed. Parked on the hard stands outside, sleek, silver, long-nosed, sat a machine that no German pilot had yet learned to fear enough. The P-51 Mustang. And today, it was going all the way. To understand what the Mustang meant, you first have to understand what was happening to American airmen before it arrived. When the United States Army Air Forces began strategic bombing operations over Europe in 1942, they arrived with a doctrine built on confidence. American planners believed in daylight precision bombing. The idea was straightforward: fly in formation in daylight at high altitude, drop bombs accurately on specific industrial targets, and cripple Germany's ability to wage war. It was a clean, logical theory. Reality was far less forgiving. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator were powerful aircraft, heavily armed, capable of carrying significant bomb loads across long distances. American crews trained hard. They believed in their machines. They believed in the mission. But the moment they crossed into German-controlled airspace, they entered a killing ground that no training had fully prepared them for. The Luftwaffe fighter force in 1942 and 1943 was among the most experienced and lethal in the world. German pilots like Hans-Joachim Marseille, Walter Nowotny, and Erich Hartmann had accumulated combat experience stretching back to the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, and the skies over North Africa. They were tactically sophisticated, flying aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190, that were fast, agile, and perfectly suited to tearing apart tight bomber formations. The standard German tactic was brutally effective. Luftwaffe fighters would climb above the bomber stream, identify the formation leaders, and attack head-on, closing at a combined speed of nearly 600 miles per hour. The closing time was less than 3 seconds. Gunners on the B-17s barely had time to track, aim, and fire before the German fighters were through the formation and banking away. Then they would come around and do it again. The American answer was the escort fighter. But in 1942 and into 1943, the escorts available, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the twin-engine P-38 Lightning, had a fundamental limitation: range. The P-47, heavy and powerful, could accompany bombers only as far as the German border before fuel forced it to turn back. The P-38 could reach slightly further into Germany, but it suffered from mechanical reliability problems at high altitude in the cold European air. Once the escorts turned for home, the bombers flew on alone. And the Luftwaffe was waiting. October 14, 1943, a date that burned itself into the memory of the 8th Air Force, the second Schweinfurt raid. 291 B-17s launched toward the ball-bearing factories of central Germany. No escort beyond the German border. 60 bombers were shot down that day. 17 more were so badly damaged they never flew again. 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon. The loss rate, over 20% of the attacking force, was strategically unsustainable. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces from Washington, understood what the numbers meant. If losses continued at this rate, the strategic bombing campaign would collapse under its own cost before it achieved anything decisive. The bomber crews understood it too. Men who completed 25 missions, the number required to rotate home, were statistically unlikely to survive. Some crews flew their first mission knowing the mathematics were not in their favor. Morale frayed. Mission planning grew cautious. Deep penetrations into Germany, the kind needed to hit the targets that truly mattered, were suspended. The Luftwaffe had simply won individual engagements. It had forced a strategic pause on the entire American air campaign. Something fundamental had to change. The answer would not come from a new tactic. It would not come from more bombers or heavier defensive armament. It would come from a single aircraft, one that had almost been canceled before it was ever built, and from a decision by one general to completely rewrite the rules of how escort fighters were used. Both were already in motion by the time the leaves turned in England in the autumn of 1943. The story of the P-51 Mustang is, in many ways, the story of what happens when the right machine arrives at exactly the right moment in history. The aircraft was not originally an American idea. In April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation with an urgent request. They needed fighter aircraft, and they needed them fast. North American had been building training planes. They had never designed a front-line combat fighter. Most manufacturers would have simply agreed to build an existing design under license. North American did something different. They proposed to design and build an entirely new aircraft, and they promised to have a prototype ready in 120 days. They delivered it in 117. The NA-73X, what would become the Mustang, was a genuinely innovative design. Its defining feature was a laminar flow wing, a shape that reduced aerodynamic drag far more efficiently than conventional wing profiles.
This gave the aircraft exceptional speed and range characteristics even before its most important upgrade arrived. Early Mustangs entered service with the Royal Air Force in 1941, but they were powered by the Allison V1710 engine, an engine that performed adequately at low altitude but lost power dramatically above 15,000 feet. For ground attack and tactical reconnaissance work, the early Mustang was excellent. As a high-altitude escort fighter, it was limited. Then came the Merlin. In 1942, British engineers, almost as an experiment, fitted a Mustang airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine. The transformation was immediate and extraordinary. The Merlin gave the Mustang supercharger performance that maintained power at high altitude, precisely where bomber escort missions were flown. Top speed jumped to over 400 miles per hour. The ceiling increased dramatically, and critically, due to the aircraft's aerodynamically efficient design, fuel consumption remained low enough to enable a combat radius that no single-engine fighter had previously achieved. North American began producing the Merlin-powered P-51B in the United States, using the Packard-built version of the engine. The first examples reached England in late 1943. When pilots began running the numbers, actual combat radius calculations accounting for fuel tanks, throttle management, and drop tanks, the results seemed almost impossible. The P-51B, carrying external drop tanks, could fly from its bases in East Anglia to Berlin and back, over 1,000 miles round trip, with enough fuel remaining to fight. For the first time in the war, American bombers could be escorted all the way to their target and all the way home. But having the aircraft was only half the equation. The doctrine that governed how escort fighters were used had to change as well. And that change came with the arrival of one man. On January 6, 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle assumed command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle was already a legend, the man who had led the audacious Tokyo raid in April 1942, launching B-25 bombers from the deck of USS Hornet to strike the Japanese home islands. He was technically brilliant, operationally bold, and he arrived in England with a clear-eyed assessment of what the escort fighter mission required. The existing doctrine ordered P-51 pilots to stay close to the bombers, to fly protective formation around the heavy aircraft, and engage only when German fighters attacked. It was a defensive posture, and Doolittle recognized it as a fundamental mistake. He changed the orders. Escort fighters were now authorized, encouraged, to range ahead of the bomber stream, to seek out Luftwaffe fighters before they could organize their attacks, to hunt, to pursue, to destroy the Luftwaffe fighter force, not just in the air, but on the ground, strafing airfields, fuel depots, maintenance facilities on the return leg of missions. The objective, as Doolittle framed it with characteristic clarity, was not simply to protect the bombers on any given mission. The objective was to destroy the Luftwaffe as a fighting force permanently, to achieve air superiority over Germany so complete that by the time the Allied ground invasion came, German fighters would no longer exist in meaningful numbers to contest it. It was an ambitious strategic vision. It required aircraft capable of executing it, and parked on the hard stands of bases across East Anglia, being fueled and armed in the cold English mornings of early 1944, the P-51 Mustangs were ready. Berlin was the ultimate test, the deepest target, the most defended airspace in the Reich. If the Mustangs could take the bombers to Berlin and bring them home, and if they could do it repeatedly, bleeding the Luftwaffe white in the process, the air war over Europe would be decided. The decision to go to Berlin had been made. The aircraft existed. The doctrine was written. All that remained was the mission itself, and the men willing to fly it.
They were young. Almost impossibly young by any modern measure.
The average age of a P-51 pilot flying escort missions over Germany in early 1944 was 22 years old. Many were younger. Boys from Kansas wheat farms, New York tenements, California orange groves. Men who had learned to drive a car only a few years before they were handed the controls of a 400-mile-per-hour fighter aircraft and pointed east toward the most dangerous airspace on the planet. The training pipeline that produced them was extraordinary in its speed and ambition. From the moment a candidate was accepted into the Army Air Force's Aviation Cadet Program to the moment he arrived at a combat unit in England, the process took roughly 1 year. Primary flight training, basic flight training, advanced flight training, then transition to the specific aircraft type, in this case, the P-51. The program was designed to compress years of peacetime flying experience into months of wartime necessity. What it could not fully compress was the psychological weight of what these men were about to face. Sitting in a P-51 cockpit at 30,000 feet over Germany was an experience of profound isolation. The cockpit was tight, the canopy close, the instrument panel inches from the pilot's face. Outside, the sky was a particular shade of blue that existed only at high altitude, deep, almost violet, utterly cold. The temperature outside the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft was 50 degrees below zero. The oxygen mask pressed against the face for hours. The engine noise was constant, a deep mechanical roar that pilots would later say they heard in their sleep for years afterward. And somewhere in that cold blue sky, they knew, German fighters were climbing toward them. The men who flew these missions carried a weight that went beyond physical danger. They were responsible not just for their own survival, but for the survival of the bomber crews. Hundreds of men in the formations below, counting on the Mustang pilots to keep the Focke-Wulfs away long enough to reach the target and turn for home. That responsibility settled on young shoulders with a gravity that no briefing room could adequately prepare a man for. Yet they flew, mission after mission, in weather that grounded civilian aircraft, through flak that turned the sky black, against opponents who had been fighting before some of the American pilots had finished high school. What sustained them was a combination of training, unit cohesion, professional pride, and something harder to define, a collective understanding that what they were doing mattered in a way that transcended individual survival. They were young, almost impossibly young by any modern measure. The average age of a P-51 pilot flying escort missions over Germany in early 1944 was 22 years old. Many were younger. Boys from Kansas wheat farms, New York tenements, California orange groves. Men who had learned to drive a car only a few years before they were handed the controls of a 400-mile-per-hour fighter aircraft and pointed east toward the most dangerous airspace on the planet. The training pipeline that produced them was extraordinary in its speed and ambition. From the moment a candidate was accepted into the Army Air Force's Aviation Cadet Program to the moment he arrived at a combat unit in England, the process took roughly 1 year. Primary flight training, basic flight training, advanced flight training, then transition to the specific aircraft type, in this case, the P-51. The program was designed to compress years of peacetime flying experience into months of wartime necessity. What it could not fully compress was the psychological weight of what these men were about to face. Sitting in a P-51 cockpit at 30,000 feet over Germany was an experience of profound isolation. The cockpit was tight, the canopy close, the instrument panel inches from the pilot's face. Outside, the sky was a particular shade of blue that existed only at high altitude, deep, almost violet, utterly cold. The temperature outside the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft was 50 degrees below zero. The oxygen mask pressed against the face for hours. The engine noise was constant, a deep mechanical roar that pilots would later say they heard in their sleep for years afterward. And somewhere in that cold blue sky, they knew, German fighters were climbing toward them. The men who flew these missions carried a weight that went beyond physical danger. They were responsible not just for their own survival, but for the survival of the bomber crews. Hundreds of men in the formations below, counting on the Mustang pilots to keep the Focke-Wulfs away long enough to reach the target and turn for home. That responsibility settled on young shoulders with a gravity that no briefing room could adequately prepare a man for. Yet they flew, mission after mission, in weather that grounded civilian aircraft, through flak that turned the sky black, against opponents who had been fighting before some of the American pilots had finished high school. What sustained them was a combination of training, unit cohesion, professional pride, and something harder to define, a collective understanding that what they were doing mattered in a way that transcended individual survival. The tactical shift that Doolittle implemented in January 1944 sounds simple in retrospect. Let the fighters hunt. But its implications were profound, and its execution required a fundamental change in how American fighter pilots understood their mission. Under the previous doctrine, a P-51 pilot watching a Focke-Wulf 190 climbing toward the bomber formation from below had one obligation: stay with the bombers, engage only when the attack developed, break off pursuit quickly, and return to the formation. It was a reactive, defensive posture that consistently surrendered the initiative to the Luftwaffe. Doolittle's new orders inverted the equation entirely. Fighter groups were now assigned not just to specific bomber formations, but to specific zones of the mission route. Lead groups flew ahead of the bombers, entering target areas before the heavy aircraft arrived, sweeping the sky of any German fighters attempting to form up for coordinated attacks. Trail groups covered the withdrawal, hunting the German fighters that circled and waited for the bombers to turn for home, fuel low and formations ragged. And on the return leg, when drop tanks were empty and bomb loads were gone, the Mustangs were ordered to come down low, to find German airfields, to strafe aircraft on the ground, in their revetments, on taxiways, parked in neat rows waiting for maintenance, to attack fuel trucks, ammunition stores, ground crews, to make the cost of operating the Luftwaffe fighter force punishing, even on days when no air battle was fought. This ground attack mission was genuinely dangerous. Low-altitude strafing of defended airfields produced significant American losses, but its cumulative effect on German air power was devastating. Aircraft destroyed on the ground counted just as completely toward the attrition of the Luftwaffe as aircraft shot down in combat. And unlike aerial combat, ground attack missions did not require German pilots to be present. The machines themselves, irreplaceable in the shrinking industrial capacity of 1944 Germany, were being systematically destroyed. The tactics were working before most people fully realized it. Every significant shift in air warfare comes down eventually to engineering. The P-51D Mustang, the definitive production variant that equipped most groups by mid-1944, was the product of a remarkable convergence of British and American engineering. The laminar flow wing, designed by North American's engineering team, gave the aircraft a drag profile that was measurably superior to any contemporary fighter. The Packard V1650 Merlin engine, the American-built version of the Rolls-Royce original, delivered consistent high-altitude performance that neither the early P-47 nor the troubled P-38 could reliably match in European winter conditions. But the single most strategically significant feature of the P-51 was its fuel capacity. With two 108-gallon drop tanks, one under each wing, the Mustang carried enough fuel to fly from English bases to Berlin and return. The drop tanks were released when empty or when combat began, restoring the aircraft's full maneuverability. Internal fuel then sustained the remainder of the mission. Pilots learned to manage their throttle settings with meticulous care, leaning the mixture, reducing RPM during cruise, carefully nursing every gallon to ensure they had enough fuel for both the fight over the target and the long journey home. The aircraft's armament, 6.5 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, was proven and reliable. The rate of fire, combined with the Mustang's speed and maneuverability, made it a genuinely lethal opponent for any German fighter it encountered. When German pilots first began reporting engagements with long-range American fighters over Berlin, fighters that had clearly flown from England, the initial reaction at Luftwaffe headquarters was disbelief. Hermann Göring, commanding the German Air Force, reportedly refused to accept the reports as accurate. Single-engine fighters over Berlin, flying from England, was simply not possible. The Mustang had made the impossible routine. Wars are won by soldiers, but they are shaped by the men who decide where those soldiers go and what they are asked to do when they get there. In the air war over Europe in early 1944, two American generals stood at the center of a strategic transformation that would determine the outcome of the entire Allied campaign. Their decisions, made in headquarters buildings far from the cold of the upper atmosphere, sent thousands of young men into the most contested airspace in history. And their willingness to accept risk, challenge doctrine, and think beyond the immediate mission changed the nature of the conflict itself. General Carl Toohey Spaatz commanded the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, the overall organization that directed both the 8th Air Force in England and the 15th Air Force operating from Italy. Spaatz was methodical, politically skilled, and absolutely committed to the strategic bombing mission. He understood that destroying Germany's industrial capacity, its oil refineries, its aircraft factories, its transportation networks, was not simply one component of Allied strategy. It was the prerequisite for everything else. No ground invasion of Western Europe could succeed against a German military still capable of full industrial output and air defense. The bombers had to go, and they had to be protected. Spaatz gave Doolittle the authority and the resources to execute the new doctrine. That institutional support, often invisible in histories that focus on the aircraft and the pilots, was essential. Changing doctrine in a large military organization requires more than one man's conviction. It requires the organizational space to act on that conviction without being overruled by caution or institutional inertia. Doolittle provided the operational vision. His restructuring of 8th Fighter Command in January 1944 was comprehensive and deliberate. He did not simply issue new orders, he changed the culture. Fighter pilots were no longer support personnel whose job was to keep bombers alive. They were hunters whose mission was to destroy an enemy air force. The distinction was psychological as much as tactical, and Doolittle understood that distinction completely. Below these two men, at the group and squadron level, commanders like Colonel Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group translated strategic vision into daily operational reality. Blakesley was a former Royal Canadian Air Force pilot who had been flying combat since 1941, one of the most experienced American fighter pilots in the European theater. He led from the front, literally flying mission after mission with his pilots, accumulating more combat hours than almost any other American fighter commander. His 4th Fighter Group, flying from Debden in Essex, became one of the highest-scoring American fighter units of the war. These leaders shared a quality that is easy to underestimate in historical retrospect: the ability to make clear decisions under conditions of extreme uncertainty and to communicate those decisions with enough conviction that men would fly into lethal danger in their execution. Leadership in war is not an abstraction. It is the specific human capacity to send people into danger and have them go willingly because they trust both the mission and the man giving the order. In the skies over Germany in 1944, that trust was being tested every single day. Wars are won by soldiers, but they are shaped by the men who decide where those soldiers go and what they are asked to do when they get there. In the air war over Europe in early 1944, 2 American generals stood at the center of a strategic transformation that would determine the outcome of the entire Allied campaign. Their decisions, made in headquarters buildings far from the cold of the upper atmosphere, sent thousands of young men into the most contested airspace in history. And their willingness to accept risk, challenge doctrine, and think beyond the immediate mission changed the nature of the conflict itself. General Carl Toohey Spaatz commanded the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, the overall organization that directed both the 8th Air Force in England and the 15th Air Force operating from Italy. Spaatz was methodical, politically skilled, and absolutely committed to the strategic bombing mission. He understood that destroying Germany's industrial capacity, its oil refineries, its aircraft factories, its transportation networks, was not simply one component of Allied strategy. It was the prerequisite for everything else. No ground invasion of Western Europe could succeed against a German military still capable of full industrial output and air defense. The bombers had to go, and they had to be protected. Spaatz gave Doolittle the authority and the resources to execute the new doctrine. That institutional support, often invisible in histories that focus on the aircraft and the pilots, was essential. Changing doctrine in a large military organization requires more than one man's conviction. It requires the organizational space to act on that conviction without being overruled by caution or institutional inertia. Doolittle provided the operational vision. His restructuring of 8th Fighter Command in January 1944 was comprehensive and deliberate. He did not simply issue new orders, he changed the culture. Fighter pilots were no longer support personnel whose job was to keep bombers alive. They were hunters whose mission was to destroy an enemy air force. The distinction was psychological as much as tactical, and Doolittle understood that distinction completely. Below these two men, at the group and squadron level, commanders like Colonel Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group translated strategic vision into daily operational reality. Blakesley was a former Royal Canadian Air Force pilot who had been flying combat since 1941, one of the most experienced American fighter pilots in the European theater. He led from the front, literally flying mission after mission with his pilots, accumulating more combat hours than almost any other American fighter commander. His 4th Fighter Group, flying from Debden in Essex, became one of the highest-scoring American fighter units of the war. These leaders shared a quality that is easy to underestimate in historical retrospect: the ability to make clear decisions under conditions of extreme uncertainty and to communicate those decisions with enough conviction that men would fly into lethal danger in their execution. Leadership in war is not an abstraction. It is the specific human capacity to send people into danger and have them go willingly because they trust both the mission and the man giving the order.
To understand how completely the air war shifted in 1944, it is essential to see it from the German perspective, from the cockpits of the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that had dominated European skies for 4 years. General Adolf Galland served as general of the fighter arm, the senior Luftwaffe officer responsible for Germany's entire fighter force through this critical period. Galland was himself an exceptional pilot, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, the Battle of Britain, and hundreds of combat sorties. He understood the technical and human realities of air combat with a clarity that many of his superiors lacked. And by late 1943, what he understood was deeply troubling. The Luftwaffe fighter force was being consumed. Not defeated in any single catastrophic engagement, but ground down, steadily and systematically, in a war of attrition that Germany was structurally unable to win. The mathematics were unforgiving. American aircraft production in 1944 was vastly outpacing German production. American pilot training, despite its compressed timeline, was producing competent fighters in numbers that Germany could not match. And critically, American pilots who survived their first few missions gained experience rapidly, becoming increasingly dangerous opponents. German pilots, by contrast, were being asked to fly more missions with less rest, in aircraft that were increasingly difficult to maintain as spare parts grew scarce and experienced ground crews were diverted to other priorities. The quality of replacement pilots entering Luftwaffe fighter units in 1944 had declined sharply from the standard of 1940 or 1941. Many arrived at frontline units with fewer total flying hours than their American opponents. When the P-51s began appearing over Berlin, when German controllers began tracking formations of single-engine fighters that had clearly flown from England, the psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was significant. The assumption that deep penetration missions would be unescorted had been a cornerstone of German defensive planning. The appearance of Mustangs over the Reich capital shattered that assumption completely. Galland later wrote with characteristic directness about this moment, describing the appearance of American long-range fighters over Germany as one of the most significant turning points of the air war. The Luftwaffe's ability to concentrate its remaining fighter strength against unescorted bombers, the tactic that had worked so devastatingly at Schweinfurt, was now gone. Every mission carried the risk of encountering Mustangs. Every engagement was now a potential attrition battle that Germany was losing. Hermann Göring's response to the crisis was denial, followed by rage, neither of which constituted a strategy. He blamed his pilots for cowardice, accused his commanders of incompetence, and refused to accept the structural realities that Galland and others were plainly identifying. The dysfunction at the top of the Luftwaffe in 1944 compounded every tactical and material disadvantage that the German fighter force was already facing. The enemy was breaking, but the men doing the breaking did not yet know it. No honest account of the American strategic bombing campaign can ignore its moral complexity.
The doctrine of precision daylight bombing, the stated justification for the entire campaign, was built on a distinction between military and industrial targets on one side and civilian populations on the other. American planners genuinely believed or genuinely argued that targeting factories, oil facilities, and transportation networks was a fundamentally different act from the area bombing that RAF Bomber Command was conducting against German cities at night. The moral framework insisted on a line between military necessity and deliberate civilian harm. In practice, that line was far less clear than the doctrine suggested. Bombing accuracy in 1944, even under ideal conditions, was limited by the technology available. Bomb sights were sophisticated instruments operated by men under extreme stress, in aircraft being thrown by flak and fighter attacks, at altitudes where human physiology itself was compromised by cold and hypoxia. Bombs fell in patterns, not on points. Industrial facilities were located within or adjacent to urban areas. Workers lived near the factories they operated. The mathematical reality of bombing from 30,000 feet meant that civilian casualties were not accidents that contaminated an otherwise clean campaign. They were a predictable outcome that planners understood and accepted. The American air crew flying these missions were not, in any meaningful sense, war criminals. They were young men executing legal orders in pursuit of legitimate military objectives in the context of a total war against a genocidal regime. But the weight of what their bombs did when they fell, in Berlin, in Hamburg, in Dresden, in dozens of German cities, was real. It settled on some of them in ways that lasted long after the war ended. The moral complexity of strategic bombing does not diminish the courage of the men who flew these missions. It simply demands that their story be told with the full weight of what it actually was, not sanitized into heroism without consequence, but understood as the profound and costly human undertaking it represented. The Mustangs that escorted the bombers to Berlin were protecting men engaged in one of the most morally complicated military campaigns in modern history. That complexity was part of what they carried with them into the sky. And now, the sky over Berlin was about to become the decisive act of that campaign. The order had been given. For the first time in the war, American heavy bombers would attack Berlin. Not an industrial suburb, not a railway junction on the city's outskirts. Berlin itself, the capital of the Third Reich, the seat of Hitler's government, the most symbolically and strategically significant target in all of Germany. The city that the Luftwaffe had sworn, implicitly and explicitly, could never be reached by American aircraft flying from England. The date set for the first attempt was March 4, 1944. The planning that preceded it was meticulous. General Doolittle and his staff had war-gamed the mission repeatedly, calculating fuel loads, fighter coverage zones, timing windows, abort procedures. The bomber force assigned was substantial, over 500 B-17s and B-24s drawn from multiple 8th Air Force bomb groups. The fighter escort would be the largest yet assembled for a single mission, with P-51 groups assigned to cover the entire route from the English coast to the target and back. The weather over Europe in early March 1944 was, as it had been for most of that winter, deeply uncooperative. March 4th began with promise. The bombers launched from their East Anglian bases in the pre-dawn darkness, climbing through broken cloud, assembling into their combat formations over the North Sea. The P-51s of the escort groups climbed to altitude and took up their assigned positions ahead of the stream, alongside it, covering the flanks. For a few hours, the mission appeared to be proceeding as planned. Then the weather closed in. Over northern Germany, a solid wall of cloud extended from low altitude to above the bomber's operating ceiling. Visibility dropped to near zero. Formation flying in those conditions, with hundreds of aircraft in close proximity, unable to see more than a few hundred feet in any direction, was not merely difficult, it was potentially catastrophic. The risk of mid-air collision within the formation exceeded the risk from German fighters. Mission commanders began transmitting recall orders. Most of the force turned back, but not all of it. A small element, 31 B-17s from the 95th Bomb Group and the 100th Bomb Group, separated from the main formation in the clouds and either not receiving the recall or too committed to their heading to safely execute a turn in the deteriorating conditions, pressed on. They crossed into the Berlin defense zone essentially alone, without the massive fighter escort that had been planned, without the protection of numbers that made bomber formations survivable. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them. What followed over the outskirts of Berlin on the afternoon of March 4, 1944, was a fierce and unequal engagement. German fighters, Bf-109s and Fw-190s from the defense of the Reich units, among the most experienced pilots remaining in the Luftwaffe, attacked the small American formation with everything available. The bomber crews fought back with the disciplined defensive fire that their training had drilled into them, gunners tracking and firing, pilots holding formation, navigators calling headings through the chaos. 5 B-17s were lost. Given the circumstances, a handful of bombers over the most defended city in Europe, largely without fighter cover, the losses could have been catastrophically worse. The surviving aircraft reached their targets and dropped their bombs before turning for the long flight home. The bombing results were modest. The symbolic result was anything but. American bombs had fallen on Berlin. For the first time in the war, the German capital had been struck by the United States Army Air Forces. The psychological impact on the German population, on the Nazi leadership, on the men in the Luftwaffe High Command who had assured Hitler that such an attack was impossible, was immediate and profound. Air raid sirens had wailed over Berlin. Bombs had detonated in the streets of the Reich capital. The war, which German propaganda had consistently portrayed as something happening far away, on distant fronts, to other people, had arrived at the center of the Reich itself. Göring's response, by multiple accounts, was fury. The idea that American bombers, escorted by single-engine fighters that had flown from England, had reached Berlin was an affront that he could not process rationally. He summoned commanders. He demanded explanations. He refused again to fully accept what the evidence was plainly showing him. 2 days later, on March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force came back. This time, the weather cooperated. This time, the full force assembled, over 660 heavy bombers, the largest American bombing force yet dispatched against a single target. And this time, the P-51 escort was complete. Hundreds of Mustangs from multiple fighter groups fanned out across the mission route, ahead of the bombers, alongside them, covering every approach vector that German fighters might use. The Luftwaffe launched everything it could. German controllers, tracking the massive formation on radar, understood immediately what was coming. Every available fighter in the Berlin defense zone was scrambled. Bf-109s and Fw-190s climbed hard from airfields across northern Germany, racing to altitude, positioning for the attack patterns that had worked so devastatingly against unescorted bombers in 1943. They found the Mustangs waiting. The air battle that erupted over and around Berlin on March 6, 1944, was one of the largest single-day aerial engagements of the entire European war. Hundreds of aircraft, American fighters, American bombers, German fighters filled the sky in a sprawling, three-dimensional battle that stretched across hundreds of miles of German airspace. Individual engagements lasted seconds. The larger battle lasted hours. The 4th Fighter Group, Colonel Blakesley's veterans from Debden, drove deep into the German fighter formations, breaking up coordinated attacks before they could develop. The 354th Fighter Group, the first unit to have transitioned fully to the P-51 in the European theater, engaged Luftwaffe fighters attempting to reach the bomber stream from the north. Across the entire battle area, American Mustang pilots were executing exactly the aggressive hunting doctrine that Doolittle had prescribed, not waiting for German attacks, but pursuing, engaging, destroying. The bombers reached Berlin. 660 heavy aircraft unloaded their bombs on the German capital in the largest American air raid the city had yet experienced. The industrial districts, the transportation infrastructure, the military installations within the city all took significant damage. Fires burned across multiple districts. The sound of American bomber engines over Berlin, a sound that German propaganda had insisted the Reich's air defenses would never permit, was heard by millions of German civilians. 69 American bombers were lost on March 6th. It was the highest single-day loss the 8th Air Force had suffered since Schweinfurt. The cost was real, and it was grievous. But the mathematics had fundamentally changed. The Luftwaffe lost 82 fighters that day, aircraft and pilots that Germany could not replace at the rate they were being destroyed. The exchange ratio had turned, and it would never turn back.
March 6th was not the end. It was the beginning of the end, and there is a profound difference between those two things. The raids on Berlin in early March 1944 did not destroy the Luftwaffe in a single day. What they did was something more significant and more lasting. They demonstrated conclusively and repeatedly that American bombers could reach any target in Germany, including the most heavily defended city in the Reich, and that American fighters could protect them all the way there and all the way home. The strategic equation had shifted irrevocably. What remained was the systematic execution of that shift, mission by mission, week by week, until the German fighter force ceased to exist as a meaningful combat organization. The instrument of that execution was the P-51 Mustang. Through March and into April of 1944, the 8th Air Force returned to Berlin and to targets across the breadth of Germany with increasing frequency and increasing force. Each mission was different in its specifics, different weather, different targets, different patterns of German resistance, but the underlying dynamic was consistent. The Mustangs arrived, the Luftwaffe rose to meet them, and the Luftwaffe paid a price it could not sustain. The pilots flying these missions were accumulating combat experience at a rate that had no peacetime equivalent. A P-51 pilot who had survived 10 missions over Germany in early 1944 had experienced more aerial combat than most peacetime aviators would encounter in an entire career. The survivors were becoming genuinely exceptional fighters, skilled at energy management, at deflection shooting, at reading the three-dimensional geometry of an aerial engagement in the fractions of a second available to make decisions. Among these men, certain names began to emerge from the statistical noise of combat reports. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group was accumulating kills at a rate that would eventually make him the highest-scoring P-51 ace in the European theater. Flying with the methodical aggression that distinguished the best American fighter pilots of the period, Preddy combined technical mastery of the Mustang with an instinctive understanding of how German pilots thought and reacted.
On August 6, 1944, he shot down 6 Bf-109s in a single mission, a feat that stood as the highest single mission score by any American pilot in the European theater flying a P-51. These individual performances mattered not just as statistics, but as evidence visible to both sides that the balance of aerial combat over Germany had fundamentally changed. The concept that Doolittle had implemented in January, using fighters as hunters rather than guards, was producing results that exceeded even optimistic projections. The strafing missions against German airfields were particularly devastating. Luftwaffe maintenance facilities, fuel dumps, and parked aircraft were being systematically attacked across northern and central Germany. The cumulative destruction was staggering. Aircraft that might have been repaired and returned to service were being destroyed on the ground before their engines could be started. Experienced ground crews, men whose skills were as irreplaceable as those of the pilots, were being killed at their workplaces. The Luftwaffe was not simply losing aircraft, it was losing the infrastructure that sustained aircraft operations. The difference was critical. An air force that loses planes in combat can potentially replace them if production continues. An air force that loses its maintenance base, its fuel supply, its experienced technicians, and its airfields simultaneously loses something far harder to rebuild. By April 1944, the evidence of Luftwaffe degradation was visible in the air. The coordinated, disciplined mass attacks that had characterized German fighter tactics in 1943, the head-on formations, the organized Schwarm attacks, the precisely timed assaults from multiple vectors were becoming less frequent. German controllers were still vectoring fighters toward American formations, but the responses were increasingly fragmented, the attacks less coordinated, the pilots less experienced. Replacement pilots arriving to frontline units were being thrown into combat with training that was visibly inadequate for the environment they were entering. The result was a terrible acceleration of attrition. Inexperienced pilots died faster. Their deaths created vacancies that were filled with even less experienced pilots. The spiral was self-reinforcing and, by mid-1944, essentially irreversible. Adolf Galland understood what was happening with painful clarity. He had been arguing for months to Göring, to the Air Ministry, to anyone with authority, that the Luftwaffe fighter force needed to be conserved, concentrated, and used selectively rather than fed piecemeal into an attrition battle it was losing. His recommendations were consistently overruled. The political pressure to defend every major German city, to contest every American raid, to be seen fighting regardless of the tactical circumstances, consumed the remaining strength of the fighter force in engagements that produced German losses far exceeding American ones. Galland would later describe the spring of 1944 as the moment when the outcome of the air war became mathematically certain, not merely probable, but certain. The numbers no longer permitted any other conclusion. But the men flying the missions did not have access to Galland's broader perspective. They knew only what they could see from the cockpit, the sky immediately around them, the bombers they were protecting, the German fighters climbing toward them. In that narrow field of vision, the war remained intensely personal and intensely dangerous. On April 8, 1944, the 8th Air Force dispatched over 600 heavy bombers to targets across Germany, aircraft factories, airfields, industrial facilities. The P-51 escort engaged Luftwaffe fighters in engagements spread across hundreds of miles of German airspace. American pilots claimed over 90 German aircraft destroyed in the air and on the ground that day alone. The actual figure, cross-referenced against German records, was somewhat lower, but the scale of destruction was real and significant. The cumulative effect of Big Week in February, the Berlin raids in March, and the sustained campaign through April had reduced the Luftwaffe fighter force to a fraction of its 1933 strength. The precise numbers varied by unit and aircraft type, but the overall picture was consistent. Germany was producing fighters, the factories were still running, the assembly lines still moving, but it was losing experienced pilots faster than any training program could replace them. And pilots, unlike aircraft, cannot be mass-produced. By the time the Allied ground forces landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe was present over the invasion beaches in numbers so small as to be operationally irrelevant. The mighty Air Force that had dominated European skies in 1940, that had blitzed London and Warsaw and Rotterdam, that had torn apart American bomber formations over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, that force was gone as a strategic entity. It had been destroyed, systematically and deliberately, by the P-51 Mustang and the men who flew it. The bombers reached Berlin, the escorts protected them, and the Luftwaffe bled white across the skies of Germany through the brutal months of early 1944, would never again contest American air power with anything approaching equality. The sky over the Reich, the sky that Germany had held for 4 years, now belonged to someone else.
When the guns fell silent over Berlin and the last formations turned westward for home, the accountants of war began their grim arithmetic. The numbers told a story that no single mission, no individual engagement, no pilot's personal account could fully capture on its own. They had to be read in aggregate, accumulated across weeks and months of sustained combat, to reveal the true scale of what had happened in the skies over Germany between February and June of 1944. The 8th Air Force had paid an enormous price for what it achieved. During Big Week alone, the sustained offensive against German aircraft production facilities conducted between February 20th and 25th, 1944, American forces flew approximately 3,300 heavy bomber sorties and lost 137 bombers with their crews. Fighter losses added further to the toll. The human cost was staggering in absolute terms. Each bomber carried a crew of 10 men. Each loss represented not just an aircraft, but an entire team of navigators, bombardiers, gunners, radio operators, young men who had trained together, flown together, and died together over the frozen fields of Central Europe. The March 6th Berlin raid alone, the decisive first full-scale American attack on the German capital, cost 69 heavy bombers and over 600 airmen killed, wounded, or taken prisoner in a single day. The 100th Bomb Group, already known within the 8th Air Force by the grim nickname the Bloody Hundredth for its disproportionate losses throughout the campaign, suffered particularly severe casualties across the Berlin missions. These were not abstractions. They were specific men with names and histories and families waiting in American towns and cities for letters that would never arrive. But the exchange, brutal as it was, had fundamentally favored the Americans. German losses during the same period were catastrophic in a way that American losses, painful as they were not. The distinction lay in replacement capacity. The United States in 1944 was the most productive industrial nation in human history. American aircraft factories were producing fighters and bombers at rates that German planners found literally incredible. The numbers, when German intelligence reported them accurately, were so far beyond German production capacity that they were sometimes dismissed as exaggeration.
American pilot training programs were processing tens of thousands of aviation cadets through a pipeline that, despite its compressed timeline, was producing competent combat pilots in industrial quantities. Germany had neither advantage. The Reich's Luftfahrtministerium, the air ministry responsible for German aircraft production, had made significant efforts to increase fighter output through 1943 and into 1944. Under the direction of Armaments Minister Albert Speer and with the organizational energy of the fighter production programs, German monthly fighter production actually increased substantially during this period, reaching figures that surprised even optimistic German planners. But increased production of airframes meant nothing without the pilots to fly them and the fuel to power them. And both were running out. The pilot shortage was structural and worsening. The Luftwaffe training program, already compressed compared to its 1940 standards, was being further shortened as the demand for replacement pilots exceeded the system's output. Pilots were arriving at frontline units with total flying hours that would have been considered inadequate for solo flight in peacetime training. They were being assigned to combat operations against American pilots who by this point had accumulated significant combat experience and were flying the most capable fighter aircraft in the European theater. The fuel situation was equally dire and would become more so. American bombing raids targeting the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești and the German synthetic fuel plants scattered across the Reich were beginning to produce measurable reductions in aviation fuel availability. By the summer of 1944, fuel shortages were directly constraining Luftwaffe operations, limiting training flights, restricting combat sorties, grounding aircraft that were mechanically serviceable but operationally useless without the fuel to fly them. The strategic shift that the Berlin raids represented was not simply a matter of air superiority over a single city or a single target set. It was the visible culmination of a broader collapse in German air power capacity, a collapse that was simultaneously material, human, and organizational. General Karl Spaatz, reviewing the campaign results from his headquarters in the spring of 1944, understood the scale of what had been accomplished. The objective that he and Doolittle had set, the destruction of the Luftwaffe as a fighting force, not just the defeat of it in individual engagements, was being achieved. The evidence was accumulating in ways that went beyond combat claims and loss ratios. It was visible in the changing character of German resistance itself, in the decreasing coordination of attacks, the declining quality of German gunnery, the increasing willingness of German fighter pilots to break off engagements rather than press them to conclusion. The Luftwaffe was not merely losing, it was disintegrating. And the men who had built that disintegration, the Mustang pilots who had flown from East Anglian bases into the heart of the Reich, mission after mission through the brutal winter and spring of 1944, were about to discover just how completely the world they had been fighting in had changed.
Victory in the air war over Germany was real, but it was not clean, it was not simple, and it did not arrive without leaving marks on everyone it touched, the men who fought it, the cities beneath it, and the broader shape of the world that emerged from it. The human cost to the 8th Air Force across the entire European strategic bombing campaign, from its first missions in 1942 through the end of the war in May 1945, was among the highest sustained casualty rates of any American military organization in the Second World War. Over 26,000 American airmen were killed in the European theater. More than 28,000 were taken prisoner. The 8th Air Force alone suffered more combat casualties than the entire United States Marine Corps across all theaters of the war. These numbers deserve to be held still for a moment. 26,000 men.
each one a specific human being, a son, a brother, a husband, a friend, each one representing a life that had been assembled across 20 or 22 years of ordinary American experience and then placed by the machinery of total war into a B-17 or a P-51 over Germany and lost. The statistical summary of their sacrifice, the clean columns of figures in official histories, cannot contain what it actually meant. It can only point toward it. For the survivors, the war's end brought its own complicated weight. Men who had flown 30 or 35 combat missions over Germany, who had watched friends die, who had nursed damaged aircraft home across the North Sea, who had sat in debriefings describing what they had seen with the flat professional language that combat required, returned to a civilian world that had no vocabulary for what they had experienced. The transition was, for many, genuinely difficult. The skills that had kept them alive over Germany, the hair-trigger situational awareness, the suppression of fear, the ability to make lethal decisions in fractions of a second, had no direct civilian application. Some carried the war quietly for the rest of their lives. Others spoke about it freely. Many found, as veterans of intense combat consistently report, that the experience had created bonds with the men they had served alongside that no subsequent relationship could quite replicate. Bonds forged in the specific crucible of shared danger and shared purpose that civilian life, however welcome, could not provide. Major George Preddy, the highest-scoring P-51 ace in the European theater, did not live to see the end of the war. On Christmas Day, 1944, during the chaos of the Ardennes offensive, Preddy was killed by American anti-aircraft fire while pursuing a German fighter at low altitude over Belgium. The irony was devastating. One of the most skilled American fighter pilots of the war, a man who had survived dozens of engagements with the best pilots the Luftwaffe could field, killed by friendly fire during the confusion of ground combat. He was 25 years old. His death was a reminder, if any were needed, that war does not conclude its cruelties simply because the strategic outcome has been decided. On the German side, the aftermath of air defeat was equally profound and far more immediately catastrophic for ordinary people. The bombing of German cities, Berlin most prominently among them, but also Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, and dozens of others, had produced destruction on a scale that defied easy comprehension. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians were killed by Allied bombing across the course of the war. Millions were displaced. Ancient city centers, urban environments that had accumulated centuries of architectural and cultural history, were reduced to rubble in single nights. The physical landscape of Germany in May 1945 was almost incomprehensibly damaged. The debate about the moral and strategic justification for this destruction continues among historians. The arguments are genuine, and the evidence is complex. What is not debatable is the scale of civilian suffering that strategic bombing produced, suffering that existed independently of its military necessity or lack thereof, and that left marks on German society and German memory that persisted for generations. There is a particular quality to the sky over Berlin on a clear day. It is vast, indifferent, unchanged by everything that has happened beneath it. The empires that rose and fell, the armies that marched through the city's streets, the bombs that fell from 30,000 feet in winter mornings in 1944. The sky simply continues, blue and cold and silent, in a way that the men who flew through it could never quite describe to the people who waited for them on the ground. But something happened in that sky, something that altered the course of a war, and through that war, the shape of the world that followed. A generation of young Americans, men who had grown up in the Depression, who had learned to fly in canvas and wire trainers over flat American fields, who had crossed an ocean to fight in a war they had not started, took the sky over Germany and held it. Not through any single act of heroism, not in one decisive battle that can be circled on a calendar and pointed to as the moment everything changed, but through the cumulative weight of thousands of missions, hundreds of engagements, the daily and unglamorous and extraordinarily dangerous work of showing up, climbing into the cockpit, starting the engine, and flying east again. The P-51 Mustang gave them the means. Doolittle gave them the doctrine. Their own courage and skill and willingness to keep going gave them the victory. What they built, the air supremacy over Germany that made D-Day possible, that protected the ground campaign from Normandy to Berlin, that denied the Third Reich the ability to defend its own capital from the air, was one of the most consequential military achievements of the 20th century. It is not always remembered in the terms it deserves, perhaps because it was accomplished quietly, systematically, in the cold air above clouds where no one on the ground could see it happening. But it happened. And on the days when the light is right and the sky over Europe stretches clear and open from horizon to horizon, blue and vast and free, that is what you are looking at. The sky that young men fought for. The sky they won.